Good day to you. Last time we did a little jockeying around in our class. In answering questions, sometimes we get a little far afield in some ways, but as I tried to say at the beginning of the course, it's really hard to get far afield in this course because it involves so much of the history of Western culture. But it was brought to my attention that there were some aspects of what I was talking about that we had not prepared in our lecture, primarily having to do with the relation of Aristotle to all this. Did anybody have a question about the relation of Aristotle to all this? We talked about him quite a bit. Well, that's part of the problem with carrying on with a course like this, is that there are just a great many things that probably the professor assumes that people are acquainted with that they're not. But we certainly need to be acquainted with Aristotle and with Thomas Aquinas in order to understand the scientific revolution that took place in the 16th and 17th century. Because in a sense, Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas represent a previous scientific revolution. It's almost never talked about in those terms. But in the 13th century, Christian theology went from a synthesis with Platonism and Neoplatonism to more of a synthesis with Aristotle. And that change, which took place in the 13th century, is very important for understanding some of the critique we've made over the last few times. The problem is, of course, that every generation, every culture has a world picture. A world picture which defines the way they look at the world. And what we're going to see much later, well, not much later, but what we're going to see later is that there is a world picture which you can put into pictorial form that actually gives you some indication of what the writer of Genesis may have thought about when he was talking about the world. And if we'll get a camera on that. The world picture of Genesis 1 is the naive one of antiquity. A picture of the earth as a flat surface resting on the primeval waters beneath the earth and separated from waters above the earth by a blue firmament. Were it not for the Creator's sustaining power, the waters would return to their original place and engulf the world in chaos. This world picture, as far as scholars can tell, is pretty close to what people at the time the book of Genesis was written would picture in their minds when they thought about the world. Up above, the waters above and below the earth. Then you have 2, 3, and 4 are the chambers of hail, rain, and snow. And then there's some sluices underneath these chambers where the hail and the rain and the snow come through. The world, as you can see, is rather flat, and it kind of has a foundation, but it's not the same kind of foundation as later Greeks would have the world founded on. But in the middle, way down in the center, is Sheol, the realm of the dead, or the pit. Now, one of the things that Bellarmine, one of the men that we talked about last time and the time before, one of the things that he was worried about with Galileo's theory was that you would lose hell. You would lose hell. In other words, if Earth was not the center of the universe, and if it did not stand still, and then there was no place for hell, because hell is supposed to be right down under us in the in the bowels of the earth. Now, that was not a required doctrine for Roman Catholics at the time, but it was a favored doctrine of Bellarmine, and so one of the problems he had with some of the speculations of Galileo was first that his speculations might allow there to be people on other planets, and second, that you would get rid of hell. And everybody knows we've got to have hell. Now, this worldview is still held by a number of people in a modified form. There was a rumor that went around, that's gone around several times in the last decade, that's been broadcast over Christian television a number of times and endorsed by some of the important leaders on Christian television. That rumor is that somewhere around the Arctic Circle, a group of oil field people have been drilling for oil, but they've been doing some experimental drilling. That is, they have unimaginable machines that can actually drill much farther than anything that we are now acquainted with. And so they're doing some experimenting in the Arctic Circle. Well, according to this legend or this story, depends on whether you believe it or not as to whether it's a legend or a story. According to this story, as they were drilling one day and they took the cap off of the drill, they heard voices coming from beneath their drill. They were faint voices, so they couldn't actually figure out what they were doing or what they were saying. So they got an incredibly long microphone and lowered it down into the drill hole. And as they got closer and closer, it was hundreds of thousands of people screaming at the top of their lungs and wailing and asking for God to get them out of this because they don't deserve this. This is just horrible. Well, according to this view, and this is still circulating in people who have college degrees from American universities, that team had found hell. It had been lost for a long time, but they had found it. And the amazing thing is that it had been found by modern scientific technology. Well, so what I'm saying is that a world picture like the one that we might have imagined that the early writers of the Bible had has not necessarily been discarded completely. But as time goes on, these world pictures do change. And this world picture, which was probably the world picture similar to the world picture of the Babylonians and Sumerians and other people in the surrounding culture, probably was the world picture of the Hebrew people. And that's what we're trying to get at when we say that you cannot go to the Bible to get a modern scientific world picture. If you go to the Bible, you will get a world picture of the people who lived at the time, and otherwise there would be no communication amongst these people. The Bible would not communicate anything to anybody if it communicated in modern Copernican or Galilean terms or Newtonian terms. And so that having been said is one of the answers to the question that we're going to be dealing with as we go along, and that is, does the Bible contain modern science? Does it contain little tidbits from biology that nobody understood at the time, but now we do? Little tidbits from astronomy that nobody understood at the time, but now we do. Now, what was happening with Galileo was the destruction of a world picture. It wasn't exactly this world picture that I've just shown you, but it was a world picture that was based primarily on Ptolemaic and Aristotelian philosophy. Now, in order to get to that point, we need to go back to the early church. And we need to understand that the early church was basically a Hebrew Jewish entity. And so I'm going to write Hebrew Christian. That is, there was a worldview that was held by the Hebrews, and Christians basically adopted this worldview and this world picture. Worldview and world picture are not necessarily the same thing. Worldview is a more comprehensive idea, but worldview usually predicts or produces a world picture. In other words, you can draw what the worldview says about the nature of the world. But Christianity is a Hebrew Christian movement. It is not a Greek movement. It later takes Greek as its language, because by the time of the coming of Jesus, most of the Jews who lived at the time Jesus was born did not live in Judea, or what we call Palestine. They lived in other parts of the world. So they spoke Greek. They were called Hellenistic Jews because the Greeks were the Hellenes. And these people had adopted Greek culture, they had adopted Greek language, and in many cases had adopted Greek philosophy, primarily Platonic philosophy, or in some cases even more bizarre Gnostic kinds of philosophies. So there was Gnosticism and Neoplatonism in some Jewish thought before Jesus was born. But as Christianity moved out into Europe, it also ran into Gnostic ideas, and these Gnostic ideas caught hold among people who considered themselves to be followers of Jesus. And so Jesus was turned basically into a Gnostic Redeemer. And a Gnostic Redeemer is a very different kind of animal from a Jewish Redeemer. A Gnostic Redeemer, for instance, does not believe that creation is good, does not believe that matter is good. Therefore, he would not really believe in the incarnation, that is, that Christ had actually become human. He would not believe in the resurrection, because what in the world do you want a resurrection for if the body is evil and there's no reason to have one? This is a pretty good swipe at biblical Christianity. But there was a time when some people were afraid that Gnosticism was going to basically win the battle within Christianity. People finally got over that for the most part. But just like anything else that affects Christianity, there are still elements of Gnosticism that have continued in Christianity as we go along, and certainly elements of Neoplatonism. Because the intellectuals who were converted to Christianity, many of them were already acquainted with Plato. And at the time they were converted, they were more than likely acquainted with Neoplatonism, which is Plotinus. But Plotinus is a Neoplatonist, which means that even though what he says is not exactly the same thing Plato said, it still derives from Plato and Platonism. And some of the early intellectual Christians assumed that Platonic philosophy, or at least Neoplatonic philosophy, was the best vehicle by which to attach the Christian stories to a philosophical, scientific worldview. And some of these people actually translated and converted Christianity totally into a Neoplatonic worldview. And you can read some of those folks. Some of their writings are still around. Others, like a man named Augustine, at first translated Christianity and biblical stories into Neoplatonic thought forms. But later in his life, he kind of shed some of these as he went along, but he never completely shed them all. And so in the early centuries of the church, even though the Bible contains no science except an antique world picture, an antiquated world picture, it adopted a science, namely the science of Neoplatonism, and that basically ruled the church until the 13th century. So, if you look at my chart, I've got Hebrew Christian there. Now, what I'm going to do is do a little cheating, historical cheating. I'm going to use the Hegelian thesis, antithesis, and synthesis to show in a very simplified way the relationship between Hebrew Christian thought and some of the later developments in the history of thought. The Hebrew Christian perspective is the thesis. What comes along after Christianity moves into Europe is Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism. And a lot of Christian intellectuals assumed that this is the way to go to make Christianity respectable, to make it philosophically sound, because that was one of the objections that a lot of philosophers had to Christianity, was that it was just a superstition. It was not a philosophy. So Neoplatonism appealed to these people because of its intellectual structure, but also because of Platonic moral structure. In fact, the moral structure of Platonism lingered on long after the philosophical structure of Platonism was judged to be inadequate for Christianity. A lot of the Platonic moralism lingered on, such as the distrust of the body. Plato said that the body is the prison for the soul. That is not a statement that Jesus or Paul or any writer in the Old or New Testament would make. That might be a statement that some Jewish Neoplatonist in Egypt would make, or some Christians after they had been introduced to Neoplatonism. But that's not something you would have come from the Bible. So, basically, in order to simplify this, the synthesis from which these two things are synthesized, or into which these two things are synthesized, is what we would call, or we might call, Augustinianism. Augustine is undoubtedly the most important thinker between Paul, the New Testament writer, and Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. And the reason why he's the most important thinker is because there were few people in the world at the time, but he was a genius of sorts, and he had the audacity and the courage and so forth to actually put forth some views that in some way synthesized what he had learned from the Christian faith and what he had learned from Neoplatonism. And so when people look into Augustine, as one guy used to say that was my teacher, you've got to chase a little Neoplatonism around in Augustine because you can find it there. Even though he considered himself to be an interpreter of the Scripture, and only an interpreter of the Scripture, because he latched on to Neoplatonism, he was interpreting the Scripture in many ways as a Neoplatonist would. And there are still people who do that today. I've read articles, for instance, in women's literature that quote Paul as if he were a Neoplatonist who hated women and hated sex. And if you begin with the assumption that Paul was a Neoplatonist, or even a Gnostic or a Manichae, then some of the things that are said in the New Testament can be twisted into that. But if you understand Paul to be a Jewish rabbi, and not having strayed very far from his Judaism and from his Hebrew thought, then these scriptures have to be understood in a very different way. But Augustinianism is one of the great syntheses of Christian history. And it was fought by early people. In other words, this was a scientific revolution that people fought, tooth and toenail. One of the old church fathers says, what has Jerusalem to do with Athens? In other words, there should be no speculation whatever trying to synthesize Hebrew Christian thought and Greek thought. Just leave that alone, because that will inevitably taint and even warp Christian ideas. And there's a sense in which that is inevitable, that tying up with something like Neoplatonism will change Christian ideas. There's also a sense in which it's inevitable that people are going to do that. In other words, when Christianity moves into a different culture, it has to in some way relate itself to the culture in which it lives. And for intellectuals who became Christians, the way to relate Christianity to the world in which they lived was to show the compatibility between Christianity and Socrates and Plato. So Augustinianism then becomes a worldview. And it does have a little problem with sexuality because Neoplatonism had a problem with sexuality. From the Neoplatonic perspective, the only good thing, the only actual being in the universe is the One, or is God. We would call God. And God is pure spirit, and he does not have any differentiation within him. He's not even a him. He does not have any differentiation within him. And his spirit has in some way, and Plato or Neoplatonus really doesn't answer this question, his spirit has in some way dipped down into nothingness, which is the Neoplatonic definition of matter. Matter is nothingness, and has produced this world in which we live. I may need to draw my own world picture of Neoplatonism before this course is over. But that means that for Neoplatonists, matter is non-being, and non-being is evil, because the only good is being. And God is supremely good because he is being itself. So if you understand Platonism and Neoplatonism, you have to understand somewhat their use of the word being and their use of word matter. Matter is not matter really isn't part of being. It is non-being. And when matter and being get mixed up together, you have things like horses and chairs and human beings, and you have men and you have women. But since the only true reality is the soul, then things that have more soul are closer to God. Things that have less soul are farther away from God. And the fact of the matter is, from Plato's perspective and Plotinus's perspective, women are just farther away from God than men are. And so sex is dallying in something that's much too dangerous, because it ties us to the world. Having sex creates prisons for souls, and we don't want souls to be imprisoned. So there are a number of ways. Augustine at first probably accepted kind of a Neoplatonic view that sex was the original sin. And in fact, a lot of people still think that's what he believed, but he changed his mind on that. He realized that you could not believe the doctrine of creation in the Old Testament and believe that sex is sin, because sex in the Old Testament is the original commandment. It's not the original sin. And so he modified it, but he didn't modify it enough, because his being the only towering figure between Paul and Aquinas, he left the impression that it is holier not to have sex. In other words, the cult of virginity that existed in Manichaeism and Neoplatonism was brought into Christianity by people like Augustine. Now, he's not the only one that did it, but by people like Augustine, who were enamored with Neoplatonism and Manichaeism and Gnosticism and other forms of things. And so he believed that sex was good, but it was only good if it was under the control of your rational mind. In other words, if you just went out and got agitated and had sex, that wasn't good sex, because that wasn't in control of your rational mind. Your rational mind knows that the only reason you have sex is in order to reproduce. And Augustine kind of figured that there were already enough souls around to begin with, and so the truly holy people should be able to overcome sex through their reason. Well, this is not New Testament. This is not Hebrew. This is not early Christian. Jewish rabbis were required to be married. They were required to participate in sexuality. It's only after Augustine and some of these other folks that the idea that clergy were required not to be married and not to participate in sexuality comes into the church. So you can see this is just one little illustration of how your theology affects your ethics, your theology affects your understanding of morality. And so when Neoplatonism became an integral part of Christian theology, churches for centuries kind of left the impression that sex was not really, God wasn't really particularly interested in us having sex. And therefore, he allowed it as a concession. But if you were really holy and wanted to be closer to God, you would avoid it altogether. And there's the story of a young monk who was walking down the street about this time, walking down the street with an older monk, and the younger monk catches the eye of a woman walking down the street. Now you have to understand that this woman wasn't half naked or anything. She was clothed, from the top of her head to the bottom of her feet. But just the fact that she was a woman was too much, supposedly, for a man to take if he really wanted to be holy. So the younger monk just took off and went around the block so he wouldn't have to pass the woman. And he was really surprised and discouraged that the older monk didn't do that. He just kept right on going. So the younger monk gets around the block and meets up with the older monk and says, "How can you just continue on your path to pass that woman?" And of course the older monk, who was very holy, said, "What woman?" So this is a very important change in the Christian worldview that took place with the inauguration of Neoplatonism as a match with Christianity. But Augustinianism held the roost until the 13th century. You wanted to ask a question?
But wouldn't that be the same thing that when Paul says it's better not to marry? Isn't this what you're talking about?
No, that wouldn't be the same thing, and we'll talk about that in more specific. It's the same thing if you read Paul as if he were a Neoplatonist. But if you read Paul as if he were an apocalyptic preacher, then what that means is in the present times, it's better for a woman not to touch a man. But if you read the text as many modern scholars read it, that's not even a statement of Paul. If you understand the Corinthian letters in which this is found, Paul is answering questions from a church that he had established. And this church has been influenced grossly by Gnostic teachers coming in behind him, claiming to have later revelations and more revelation. And so they were doing all kinds of things to his church. For instance, they were denying the resurrection. Since they didn't believe in the goodness of the body, they were denying that the resurrection occurred. So chapter 15 is a discussion of the resurrection. They were also denying that sex was good, so chapter 7 is a discussion of that. And probably, according to many scholars, you can't prove this, but according to many scholars, this is the question that he received in a letter, or a statement that he received in a letter from these people that had been influenced by Gnostics. It's better not to touch a woman. Just like there is no resurrection, and so on. Anyway, that's a very complex issue, but the only reason I say more about it is to get you to look into it a little bit more, because in chapter 7, what Paul is trying to do is to get people who have separated themselves sexually because of these Gnostic teachers. He's trying to get them back together. And he says, for instance, in that same chapter, if you want to separate sexually for a little while, which they were doing on Gnostic principles, if you want to do that a little while, if you want to fast and pray, that might be acceptable. Get back together as soon as possible, because that is a misunderstanding of human nature and reality, to consider sexuality to be somehow evil. So in that chapter, Paul is actually encouraging people to have sex if they are married, and encouraging people to get married if they cannot live without sexuality. But he's telling only people who are not married, who if they get married, will have a great deal of difficulty in times of persecution and the time of the end of the world. He's telling them not to get involved. But that's a totally different thing from Gnostic asceticism. Gnostic or Manichaean asceticism says that sex is evil per se. And the reason why you avoid it is because you're avoiding evil. That was not Paul's view. Anyway, we might run into that a little later. We've got Augustinianism down here. And in the 13th century, here comes another guy, besides Plato, who has been around all this time, but he hasn't been used in any Christian synthesis, and that is Aristotle. Aristotle was kept alive not in the Christian Europe, but in Islam. And so a great many of the Aristotelian philosophers of the 12th and 13th century were Islamic scholars. And this was also the period in which Islam had dipped considerably into Europe. You know, there was a time when Europeans were afraid, deathly afraid, that they were going to lose out on the world scene to Islam, because Islam had made great inroads into Europe. But some of the intellectual Christians kind of liked the intellectual Muslims, and so they learned from them. And one of the things they learned from them was about Aristotle. And Aristotle, it seemed to them, was a better vehicle for carrying the Christian message than Neoplatonism. For one thing, Aristotle was more, quote, scientific than Plato or Plotinus was. He gave more substance to matter, which they liked. But he also went too far in some situations, because Aristotle evidently believed that when the body dies, the soul dies. So that was a very different proposition from Plotinus. And so there were things about Aristotle they could not accept. For instance, that when the body dies, the soul dies. Or that the world is eternal. That is, the world was not created, but is eternal. That was Aristotle's view. Well, Christian theologians had a hard time accepting that, since they had committed themselves to the Genesis and to the concept of creation. And in fact, what really bothered a monk named Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, was that some of these Christian theologians were actually putting forth a double truth theory. That is, something can be true in Christian theology and the exact opposite be true in philosophy, because they had such high regard for Aristotle. If Aristotle said that the world was eternal, and Christians and the Bible seemed to indicate that the world was not eternal, in order to accept Aristotle, they had to develop kind of a double truth theory. That according to the Bible, which we believe, the earth was created. But according to Aristotle, which we also believe, the world was not created. Well, you may wonder how people can wrap their minds around such a thing, but intellectuals can do lots of things. And so that's what they were doing at the time. Thomas Aquinas, on the other hand, thought, this is insufferable. You cannot have double truth. He liked Aristotle, but he wanted to make sure that we understood that Aristotle was compatible with Christianity, even though we had to get rid of some of the things he said. You had a question.
I was going to ask if it was so easy for them to accept Aristotelianism with the Bible. Why was it so hard to overturn that with all of the stuff with Galileo?
Well, it wasn't any harder. That's what I'm going to show you. That's what I mean by saying that there was a scientific revolution in the 13th century. Before Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle, almost all the points about Aristotle were condemned by the church. Thomas Aquinas was a very courageous person. He was at least as courageous as Galileo, because Thomas Aquinas continued at the University of Paris to believe in Aristotle and to teach Aristotle. And so Aristotle became necessary for, if you're going to get a Master of Arts at the University of Paris, Aristotle became necessary. But it had already been condemned by much of the hierarchy before. And it was condemned after, it was again condemned after Thomas Aquinas' death. So actually the resistance to Aristotle lasted longer than the resistance to Galileo. But by the time of Galileo, Aristotle had just completely won the day. And there were still some Neoplatonists around, like the Franciscans and the Augustinians. You can imagine that the Augustinian friars would be Neoplatonists. And Luther was an Augustinian friar, which is one reason why he despised Aristotle and called Aristotle's philosophy the devil's whore. So when you're talking about the Middle Ages, and even the latter part of the Middle Ages, you're not talking about a system that just accepted things and there was never any critique. You're talking about a system in the High Middle Ages in which there were very substantial revolutions about scientific thinking. And one of the most substantial revolutions was the switch from Plato to Aristotle. But it became so powerful that the Roman Catholic Church, once it switched to Aristotle, has kept Aristotle up until recent times as the great doctor of the church. And we have in the city of Houston the only well thought of graduate school in which you can get a master's degree in Thomas Aquinas, in Thomism. And that's at the University of St. Thomas. So obviously a church, a school named after Thomas Aquinas, and one whose priests and religious are connected with a religious group that is very pro-Aristotle, would continue. Another interesting event is that even though Luther tried to get Protestantism away from Aristotle, or Aristotle away from Protestantism, or whichever way you want to put it, there are now some fundamentalist evangelical Christians who have become Aristotelians because they consider Aristotelianism to be the bulwark against modern Protestant liberalism. So when you talk about these things, you're talking about a very complex issue. They did not accept Aristotle easily. The only reason why they eventually accepted it was because of the work of Thomas Aquinas, who got rid of this double truth theory and presented a synthesis of Aristotle and Christian faith, which is an immense bulwark of rational thought in the High Middle Ages. If you think you're educated, go try to read a couple of pages of Thomas Aquinas. You need to have a whole history of philosophy and theology before you can do that. So Thomas Aquinas is still greatly admired in the Roman Catholic Church and in some secular moralists. Aristotle is still highly regarded, and among even some evangelical Protestants. But Aristotle was condemned before Thomas Aquinas adapted him, and he was condemned again after Thomas Aquinas adapted him. But the influence of the University of Paris and the influence of Aristotelians, Thomists, won the day. It probably, as I say, took longer than it did for Galileo and Copernicus to win the day. Well, anyway, if you, looking again at the chart, if you synthesize Augustinianism as the thesis, Aristotle as the antithesis, then what you come up with is, guess what? Thomism, which is one of the great intellectual syntheses in history. And this took place at the height of the Middle Ages. It did not take place after the rise of modern science. It took place at the height of the Middle Ages, when there was still a tremendous amount of ferment. And the strictures of the hierarchy, some parts of the hierarchy. Again, this is a fight among Christians. Thomas Aquinas was a Roman Catholic. He was a dedicated Roman Catholic. So when he fought with other Roman Catholic priests, this was not a battle between the new science of Aristotle and, this was not a fight between the new science of Aristotle and Christianity. This was a fight among Christians over how much they should use Aristotle in their theology. And Aristotle won big time. He won big time. And that's one of the things that some of the Protestant theologians were arguing against, even though Aristotle was still very influential in some of Luther's descendants, such as Melanchthon, and in John Calvin, and particularly some of his descendants. Does that answer that question? I answer questions with overkill. I guess you've noticed that. But it's really very important because these are good questions, and people can't follow the line of our discussion without understanding those things. But here comes Thomism as a synthesis of Augustinianism and Aristotle. One thing you'll notice if you accept this thesis-antithesis scheme seriously, which Hegel and Marx both did, except in different ways, Augustinianism is one step removed from the Hebrew Christian viewpoint. But Thomism is two steps removed, because Thomas Aquinas wasn't synthesizing Aristotle with biblical thought. He was synthesizing Aristotle with Augustinianism, which he considered the same thing as biblical thought. So this scientific revolution is the one that produced the context for the later scientific revolution that took place with Copernicus and Galileo. Because in order to establish their scientific doctrines, they had to fight Thomism. They had to fight Aristotle. Thomas Aquinas was so good at this. He came to the conclusion that even if Aristotle was correct that the earth was eternal, that was not in contradiction to the biblical idea that God created the earth. Because with Aristotle you can do that. In other words, if creation is understood as being grounded in being, then it doesn't make any difference when it started or how long it's been. It's still grounded in the being of God. So now, Thomas Aquinas didn't come to this conclusion, but one of the things he does show in his writings is that no scientific theory will necessarily clash with the biblical doctrine of creation. We're having debates these days about what is the relationship between the Big Bang theory and science. Well, there are a lot of people who believe that the Big Bang theory is the greatest thing that's ever happened for Christian theology. That is, it is compatible with the idea of a creation in sometime in the past. Whereas the steady state theory, which was basically kind of the Aristotelian idea that everything was eternal, was not. But even Thomistic theologians, when the steady state theory was in vogue, could show not that they believed in the steady state theory, but that the steady state theory itself was as compatible with Christian doctrine of creation. Because if something exists, it is grounded in being. Being is God. And so you can interpret creation in such a way that you can believe that the earth has always existed. Because you've already got somebody who always existed. Who's that? You've got God. And so even though the church did not go to this particular doctrine, it shows the wide range of Aquinas' ability to synthesize Aristotle with the Christian faith. Now, the way Thomas got rid of this problem of double truth was, he said, that nature completes or fulfills, grace fulfills nature. He believed that there was not much you could prove about God from science, except that there was one God, that he existed, and that he was one. Thomas Aquinas didn't believe you could prove anything else about God from science or philosophy, except that God exists and he is one. And connected with that he is orderly and is the first cause and all of these kind of things. He's also the final cause. And so, what about these other doctrines? What about the doctrine of the Trinity? Obviously, you can't get the doctrine of the Trinity from Aristotle. That didn't bother Aquinas at all. He believed in a little idea which is not picked up very much more in the discussions of science, and that's the idea of revelation. He believed that there were some truths that were just as true as any scientific truth, but the only way you could know them is if God chooses to reveal them to you. So that's what he meant by saying that grace fulfills nature. And so from his perspective, you could learn a great many things from nature. This is what you call natural theology. You can learn a great many things by nature. Some of these are about God, very few things about God, but you can learn things about morality, and this was the concept of natural law. And you know, we have a natural law party in the United States. And I don't know whether the man's Catholic or not. I've never looked into it, but he's one of the guys that are running on the Perot ticket. You know, the Perot ticket is divided into two different guys, Buchanan and this other man whose name escapes me, but he is the natural law candidate. In fact, he's listed as the natural law candidate in California. And his view, as is the view of at least one or two of the justices of the Supreme Court, is that law should be, positive law should be grounded in natural law. Now, that's not a majority on the Supreme Court, but that's the view, for instance, of Clarence Thomas and I'll have to think of the other man's name. But they've done a lot of writing on natural law. In fact, that was one of the things that came up in their that was criticized by more liberal philosophers and lawyers and so forth, was that they were trying to import natural law, which is supposedly a theological thing, into their decisions. But there's a pretty good movement toward natural law these days. Natural law is, of course, the basis of the Catholic position on abortion, for instance. In other words, there is no specific scripture in either the Old or the New Testament that says, "Thou shalt not commit abortion." But the Catholics are absolutely convinced, that is, most Catholics are absolutely convinced that that is still an immoral act, and in fact it's an act of murder because of natural law. In other words, God's law is revealed law, and it's also natural law. And why would God create this zygote, this embryo in the womb, if he wanted it to be killed? You know, that's basically an argument from natural law, that this infant has a purpose. And if you kill this infant, and this is Aristotle, if you kill this infant, then that infant will never be able to fulfill its purpose. Now, a lot of people kill people, so a lot of people are not able to fulfill their purpose, but that doesn't justify it from the perspective of natural law. Okay, does anybody have a question or comment? Yes.
So, in the letter to the Grand Duchess, Galileo addresses this when he talks about the two books of God. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah. This was already an idea that was floating around, but Galileo picked up on it, and all of the Christian scientists who picked up on Galileo also picked up on it. And as I said, it was a long time before there were any scientists who were not Christians. And so there was just no doubt in the minds of scientists like Newton and other people that nature displayed God. That is, Newton believed that his science was a theological work, and he dedicated it to the greater glory of God, all of his scientific work. And what was floating around was this idea that God has two books. And this is already, at least the germ of the idea, in Augustine, that God has two books. One is the book of nature, and you read the book of nature one way, and the other is the book of the Scripture, and you read that book a different way. For instance, as Galileo pointed out, you do not read Scripture to find out if the earth goes around the sun or if the sun goes around the earth, because Scripture does not discuss that subject. It is revealed in the context of an ancient perspective, but it does not discuss that subject. In other words, now he probably thought, this seems to be what he indicates, he probably thought that the writers of the Bible knew that, but that they accommodated themselves to the people of their time, that God accommodated himself. So that's the reason why Galileo had no problem accepting a view which the church did not accept, because from his perspective, the church had gotten this view illegitimately. They had got it from the Bible instead of looking at the source of information like this, which is nature. So the scientists, including almost all scientists up through the 19th century, held very strictly to the idea of the two books of God, the book of nature, the book of science. And this was also the dynamic behind the critique of Aristotle, because Aristotle's science was actually based many times on theology rather than on empirical evidence.
I think I read this weekend that they were saying, or it was saying that he believed that the Bible described things that were beyond human reason, and then left the book of nature, I guess, to be something that was composed of things that human nature could figure out.
Yeah, that's one way of talking about it. Yeah, what is beyond reason, beyond philosophy, beyond science. They did not believe that what's beyond science was untrue. They just didn't believe that you should try to find out what is beyond science through science or through the study of nature. From their perspective, the way you find out how many planets there are is not to consult somebody's theology, but you look. You just look. And up until Galileo's telescope, of course, people were not able to look. So when an Aristotelian looked up in the heavens and saw 7 things that moved in the heavens, his observation fit with his theology, fit with what he already believed because of Aristotle's philosophy. So when Copernicus when Galileo comes along and notices that there are more things out there that move, then a revolution, scientific revolution, is beginning to take place. Instead of saying, you ask the question, how many teeth does a cow have? Well, a philosopher might say, well, a cow has 24 teeth. And someone says, well, are you sure of that? Of course. Why don't you go look? Well, I don't need to look. A cow has 24 teeth. It is really a revolutionary idea to actually go and open the cow's mouth and count the teeth. And that's the difference between science from Galileo's perspective and science from the Aristotelian perspective.
One of the problems I see when I'm reading the letter to Galileo is that it seems at times Galileo is saying that it's more important to look at nature to understand God, and that really almost the Bible and to a degree the church take a back seat. And then he seems to turn around and say, yes, but we have to give deference to the Bible and the church. And it almost seems like he's really waffling on this, and I have a hard time deciphering just exactly what is he saying.
Well, probably he is waffling, and he's not waffling deliberately. What he is he's a revolutionary thinker. And modern science is not exactly what Galileo thought it was. Modern science is not exactly what Newton thought it was. So in a sense, they did waffle. For instance, when we get to Newton, we're going to find out that Newton was probably the primary cause for scientific naturalism, even though he himself was not a scientific naturalist. He himself believed that there was a God and that God had created everything, but he set the stage with his mechanics, making the universe into a mechanical system. He set the stage for later deism, which argued, of course, there's a God. I mean, you could not have convinced Thomas Jefferson that there was not a God. His whole worldview would have exploded. But you could convince Thomas Jefferson that God didn't have much to do with nature anymore, that he had created it and he had set it loose, and now it was operating on principles. But even Thomas Jefferson was not a scientific naturalist in the fullest sense of the word. He was a deist, and he believed, for instance, that all moral law comes from God, and that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That's pretty strong natural law, but it's deistic natural law. And so he liked Jesus, and he produced his own version of the New Testament. But in his version of the New Testament, we're talking about Thomas Jefferson, in his version of the New Testament, he cut out all the passages that said anything about supernatural events or miracles or anything like that, because he was a Newtonian. So even though Newton believed that the supernatural God had created the world, and that if God ceased to exist, then the universe would cease to exist, he kind of laid the groundwork for methodological agnosticism or even methodological atheism. And so that's one of the things we're going to see. In other words, we can emphasize that Galileo did not see a problem in being a Christian, and being a very conservative Christian, and at the same time affirming his scientific views. Same thing is true with Newton, though he was not quite as conservative a Christian as Galileo was. He was kind of a Unitarian, but even Unitarians in those days were very conservative Christians. They just didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. They didn't believe in the Trinity. So he could carry these two things around with him. In fact, Newton carried some other things around, as did Copernicus and other people, and that is what we sometimes today would call witchcraft, or views about science which have been just totally obliterated by modern science. And they all carried these in the same brain. These were big brains. Okay, any other questions? Now, eventually we're going to have to, we've gotten back behind Galileo now quite a bit this morning. We've gotten back behind him to Aquinas. We've gotten back behind him to Augustine. And we've even got back behind him a little bit to the biblical material. But it's going to be very important for the modern discussion to pay a great deal more attention to the biblical material. And that's what we're going to be doing from now on quite a bit. You remember my propositions. The Bible contains no modern science, but the Bible does contain a worldview, a world presuppositions, a perspective without which modern science could not have developed, or at least did not develop. In order to get at that, we're going to have to look at this world picture and to see how important this world picture, which is behind the biblical materials, is to understanding the world view, which comes out of Hebrew thought. Another thing that Bellarmine was worried about Aquinas. I told you he was worried about worried about Galileo. He was worried about Galileo because he was afraid that he would lose hell, that hell couldn't be in the center of the universe. He was also worried about the resurrection and the ascension of Christ. If the world does not stand still, then how can you believe in the ascension of Christ? So his belief in what the ascension of Christ was dependent upon his world picture. Well, no theologian, even fundamentalist theologians today, most of them do not connect their belief in the ascension of Christ to the pre-Galilean view of the world, the pre-Galileo view of the world. They assume that Christ could ascend from the earth even if the earth goes around the sun. Now, there has to be a little thought that goes into this, and very conservative Christians have been thinking for a long time. So it's not as though they haven't figured things out. But even very conservative Christians these days have to allow for a little bit of symbolic language or a little bit of mystery about the nature of the universe in order to get Jesus ascending someplace. And one of the ways they do that these days is to talk about dimensions. In other words, very conservative Christians are now using terms like dimensions because that's more of a modern scientific perspective. For instance, when Jesus in John says, "In my Father's house are many mansions," in the old King James Version, what do you think of when you hear the word mansion? He's saying, I'm going away, but I'm going to come back and get you, because in my Father's house are many mansions. Now this is in John, which is highly symbolic. So he talks about the ascension, but he talks about it in different ways than the other Gospels do. What are the mansions? What do you think of? Go ahead, tell me what you think of when you hear the word mansion. I was raised in a very conservative Christian culture where we sang songs that talked about, I'm satisfied with just a cottage below, but in that city there's a mansion waiting for me. And sometimes we got humble and said, now I know that you got a mansion prepared for me, but I just want a little cottage at the foot of the hill. Anyway, what that is a misunderstanding of what the word mansion means in the King James Version. The word mansion does not mean a house like is in River Oaks. The word mansion means something like what we today mean by dimension. That is, this that you are familiar with is not the only reality. There's reality beyond this. And I'm going to that reality. He's not explaining what it is. He's just saying that there is. I'm going to that reality, but I'm going to come again and receive you to myself. So it's quite easy then for very conservative Christians who have finally accepted the Galilean hypothesis, though there were fundamentalist Christians even up into the 1880s that did not in America. Almost all of them have accepted it now, and so they have no problem thinking of Jesus symbolically being raised up and then translated into a new dimension. Not that he, took a left at the moon and then a right at Jupiter and ended up somewhere else, though there's still people that kind of have that idea of the ascension of Jesus. But that's certainly not necessary to any orthodox view of Jesus. C.S. Lewis, for instance, was a Christian writer, British Christian writer, who got letters from everybody, and he answered letters. One of the letters he got was, how can a person who lives in a modern scientific world believe that Jesus Christ sits on a throne at the right hand of the Father? And C.S. Lewis's answer was, the Bible was written for adults, and it has to be read like an adult book. The idea that that is a literal description, he said, was condemned hundreds of years ago by the church. That's not a literal description of anything, but it's a real description, he says. In other words, Christians believe that Jesus really is sitting at the right hand of God, by which you mean what? He's in command. He's leaning on God's breast, so to speak, at the table. The Jews already had this picture of Abraham's bosom, that when you died, you went to Abraham's bosom. Well, when I was a kid, I heard preachers talking about going to Abraham's bosom. Man, I couldn't figure out what a bosom was. I knew 2 or 3 definitions of a bosom, but what I finally figured out was that Abraham up in heaven had a huge plexiglass stomach. There wasn't any plexiglass at the time, so I guess I must have thought it was glass. But that Abraham had this huge stomach, and he was now so big that you could look into his bosom and see these people sitting around the table. Well, that's just a misunderstanding of culture. What it means to sit in Abraham's bosom means to sit on his right hand and to lay your head on him because you are the honored person at the table. Now you can take that in a literalistic fashion, in which when you do, you just make hash of the idea that's being communicated, or you can take it as a symbolic message that comes from the culture out of which it comes. And so C.S. Lewis says the same thing about doctrines like this. And he's a very conservative Christian, so conservative Christians don't have a problem with what some scientists think they should have a problem with, because they're not. Many of them are not as literalistic as scientists are when they read the Bible. Okay, any other questions? Have I answered them all? I said we were going to have to go back farther. And in order to set the stage for that, let me let something out of the bag here this morning that we're going to deal with quite a bit. If you look at your camera chart, the crucial question in the creation account of Genesis is not science versus faith. It is polytheism versus monotheism. It is polytheism versus monotheism. From the same book. The fundamental question at stake could not have been the scientific question of how things achieve their present form and by what processes. This is from the book, The Meaning of Creation, which you have. So the fundamental question at stake could not have been the scientific question of how things achieve their present form and by what processes, nor the historical question about time periods in chronological order. The issue was idolatry, not science. The book of Genesis was written to fight polytheism, not to fight for any kind of scientific perspective. Affirmation of faith in one transcendent God, not empirical or speculative theories of origin, attempting to be loyal to the Bible by turning the creation accounts into a kind of science or history, is like trying to be loyal to Jesus by arguing that his parables are actual historical events and are only reliable and trustworthy when they are taken literally as historical reports. Now, I've had teachers who actually believed that. In other words, they were so afraid of taking anything in the Bible not literally that they argued that everything that Jesus said was literally true. Now, this runs into a brick wall some places. For instance, when Jesus says, "I am the door," even these people don't expect to get a splinter when they go through the door, which is Jesus. But still, I've heard people argue that the parable, for instance, the parable of the prodigal son or the parable of the Good Samaritan, had to be a literal historical account of something that really happened. Well, it may be. Things like that did happen. But the story of the prodigal son and the story of the Good Samaritan are very unlikely stories to have happened. That's the reason why Jesus tells them. It's unlikely that a Samaritan would have stopped on the road and picked up a Jew and took him and got him help. It's unlikely that a Jewish son would have got away with what this Jewish son did in the parable of the prodigal son. And I may talk about that more extensively later, to emphasize the fact that the Bible is story material. It is not scientific material. It is not an attempt to give us literal historical events. It does give us literal historical events, but that's not its primary purpose. And so when it does tell a story, whether the story is a literal historical event makes no difference if it's a parable. We can understand that in other kinds of literature, like fables. And I've heard people say, well, these modernist scientific Christians think that there are fables in the Bible. You ever heard that? Well, the problem is that there are fables in the Bible. Unless you know what a fable is, then you ought not go saying there's not one in the Bible. There are lots of fables in the Bible. One of the most prominent ones is the fable of the trees picking a ruler over them, and they have a fight about who should rule over them. That's a fable, and it's right in the Bible. But it's not meant to be taken literally. It's meant to be taken for the point that a fable makes. So, in one way we're going to have to change our way of looking at things is to understand how important it is that we learn what genre or what kind of literature the Bible is. And the Bible is not meant to give us science. It's meant to tell us that there's only one God and that we are all absolutely dependent on Him without exception. And everything that He has created is absolutely dependent upon Him without exception. And if you get that lesson from the Bible, from the book of Genesis, then you have learned what the book of Genesis was written for. If you spend hours of your time trying to get science out of Genesis 1, then, as I've said before, you've wasted your time, and you have not spent any time trying to find out what the book is trying to tell you. Does everybody understand that point? And that's a great deal of what we're trying to accomplish, is to give you the historical, literary, and philosophical background to understand how to read the Bible. And if more people did that, then these fights that go on in the newspapers between scientists and religious people would kind of die out a little bit. There's not as many fights going on really among scientists and Christians as there are in the newspapers. But the newspapers do dwell on this kind of thing. And when they do, we lose.